Okay, so I'll just go ahead and, and get started. Thanks for being here, everybody. My name is Ariel Fishkin. I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator at Humboldt Domestic Violence Services. So before we get into the meat of the presentation, which Paula will introduce herself after, I just wanted to give a brief overview of Humboldt Domestic Violence Services and some of what our core services are. So we offer a 24-hour support line, and that is both for survivors as well as family members, friends, community members who maybe want to get advice about a situation. Also to note, you don't have to actively be in crisis to call. It's for anyone who's at any stage in their journey. So that's why we call it a support line rather than a crisis line. We offer one-on-one peer counseling, which is sort of on an ongoing basis. Anyone who's a client with us at any time can make a one-on-one peer counseling appointment. We offer support groups with childcare. When everything is operating normally, we have them twice a week. We offer domestic violence restraining order assistance, and we also provide court accompaniment to domestic violence restraining order hearings. We offer referrals, of course, to partner agencies such as North Coast Rape Crisis and other agencies who provide services that are outside of our scope. And we also provide emergency food, clothing, and sheltering on a limited basis. So the way for anyone to get hooked up with our services is to call the support line number you see at the bottom there, 707-443-6042. And that's also the best line if you have any questions about what our services, how we're operating at any, things change so quickly. So please call the support line if you have any questions about our services. And our business office number is for donations and any, media related inquiries, stuff like that is the business office number. So that is us. And at this point, I'll pass it over to Paula with North Coast Rape Crisis. Oh, you're muted,
I'm
Paula.
talking away to myself. Hi, everybody. This is Paula. I'm with the North Coast Rape Crisis team. We're really happy to be here partnering with Humboldt Domestic Violence Services. I'm going to share my screen, and I want to say that while we're going through the slides, that we're a small group today, so I want you all to feel comfortable. I hope to go ahead and unmute yourself altogether, or when you have something that you want to say, and we can have maybe have a conversation more than just me talking at you. For some reason, I'm having a moment of difficulty here.
And also just wanted to say that I will be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you don't feel comfortable unmuting yourself, you can put something in the chat, and I will. I'll speak it for you.
You'll let me know. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. So Ariel and I had talked about just wanting to share some information about sexualized violence within intimate partner violence or domestic violence, and also specifically how the COVID situation seems to be impacting survivors that both of our organizations and I'm sure other organizations serve. So I'm going to share a little bit of information with you about rape crisis services in case you don't know them. If you have any questions at any time, just let me know. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the dynamics of sexual violence when it is happening within the context of intimate partner violence, impacts of COVID on those who are currently with abusive partners or being impacted by abusive partners, and hopefully what all of us might be able to do to assist the person who's experiencing that. So before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment just to invite us all to take a breath. And to remember that if we're not okay, then we're not going to be okay to assist anybody else. So we'll come back to breathing, but just try to remember to keep that in mind for yourself or whatever helps you. So North Coast Rape Crisis Team, like Humboldt Domestic Violence Services, provides a lot of free and confidential services. We have 2 hotlines because we serve 2 counties, Humboldt and Del Norte. We have our main offices in Eureka. We have an office in Crescent City. And then we also have an auxiliary office on the Humboldt State University campus. People who can call us, of course, survivors of any age, any gender, and no matter when the violence happened. So someone might call us because today they were violated in some way, or they might call us about something that happened many, many years ago in their life. And similarly to what Ariel said, people don't have to be in some high state of crisis. We're here to listen, believe, and offer support, regardless of the context of what they experienced or when it happened. And sometimes people call us and they're not even sure that what happened to them would be called abuse or assault, and they're certainly welcome to call us too. As are their significant others, people in their lives who might be looking for ways to support somebody or dealing with their own secondary trauma. That's true for all community members and professionals too. And of course, you know, everything that's shared with us in person or in the hotline is absolutely confidential, and we're able to maintain privileged communication, so not being subpoenaed in or having our records subpoenaed into court. And we deal with a whole wide variety of forms of abuse in different contexts. So because we work a lot with folks who've been sexually abused or assaulted within an intimate partner situation, we're also, of course, listening and supporting people around all of the other ways that their abuser might be harming them. And that's similar with child abuse. Because we are primarily with children focused on sexual abuse, but we understand that there could be many layers of different forms of abuse or other hard situations that young people are in, and so we would want to support them around all of that. We provide a kind of a one-time initial appointment, and in normal times people come in. Now that would be offered either we're just starting to do have people come back into the business office, so that could be in person or it could be virtually. And then we offer additionally up to 12 sessions where somebody meets with the same counselor. And again, we're just starting again to have people come into the office again, or if they're not comfortable with that, they can do that on the phone. And we're going to have some other virtual ways of doing that, we hope soon. Normally we run survivor groups. They're closed and run in 10-week cycles. But a survivor can stay in multiple cycles if it feels healthy and helpful for them to do so. But the makeup of the group might shift a little bit every 10 weeks, some people leaving and new people coming in. Right now we're not doing those, but we're looking at different ways that we might be able to get that going again. We are advocates like HDVS, so trying to be there in support of people, making sure they know their rights, options, choices, not trying to influence them in any direction, but supporting the choices they make, and supporting them in speaking their own truth and naming what they need to have happen or want to have happen, and sometimes speaking on their behalf if they're asking us to do that. And we go a lot of different places. We're always called out if there's a forensic exam, sometimes called a SART, that happens after a sexual assault. We're automatically called to the hospital for those. But we also accompany people on other kinds of medical appointments, law enforcement interviews, and throughout the court process. And providing a lot of information and resources, hopefully along the way, including we're often cross-referring to Humboldt Domestic Violence Services, as well as all the tribal and other Native organizations, and basically anybody who's out there who's willing to partner. And then we do a lot of prevention education with children as young as preschool all the way through high school, and then at the college and university level, as well as a lot of trainings and workshops for adults in the community or trainings for professionals. And during COVID, we're not currently offering self-defense classes, but we hope that we'll restart that when things get better. So, looking at intimate partner violence at the intersection of sexual violence, we're going to talk a little bit about how it happens, what it might look or sound like when somebody is trying to describe it to us. They're not likely to use words like rape, even though that might be what happened to them. But there's other ways that they might describe the experience that you might be able to recognize. And then we're going to talk about how we can respond in a supportive way to reducing those barriers and increase their protective factors, and particularly as it relates during this time of the pandemic. So last week, if you were on that Zoom, Ariel did a really great job of going through and talking in detail about the ways in which multiple different strategies are used by abusers and how that plays out in different relationships. And so I just put this up here as a reminder. It's a version of the power and control wheel. There are lots of different versions, but what they all have in common is showing us all of these different strategies that are used within intimate partner or domestic violence, all with the same goal: to have power over and control of the partner, and that same dynamic then playing out with any children that happen to be exposed to it.
And Paula,
So yes?
sorry, just to say real quick, if folks weren't here last week, the webinar that we did that goes really in depth into the power and control wheel will be on Humboldt Domestic Violence Services YouTube page. So if you want to see an in-depth discussion of that, you'll be able to find it there.
Great, thank you, Ariel. And I really think that intimate partner violence really comes down to strategies and tactics that abusers use, paired with what they perceive to be vulnerabilities in their partner. All of us, all humans, have places where we are more or less vulnerable. So that's not to say that people who are being harmed by their partner, I'm not naming them as, quote, vulnerable people. I'm saying that we all have vulnerabilities. So for example, if I were economically dependent on my partner, then financial or economic abuse might be the strategy that they would have as a go-to, because it would be more likely to be successful as a way of controlling me, differently than maybe if I'm not as financially dependent on that person. And that's true for every one of these strategies. And the one that I'm going to focus a little bit is sexual abuse. So sexual abuse is one of those. On the power and control wheel, go back, you see that physical and sexual violence is the frame, and it's kind of the container. Any one of these things could be happening and there not be direct physical or sexual violence. When there is physical or sexual violence, then some of these other strategies become even more powerful in terms of impact, because if you've ever been physically harmed or sexually assaulted by the partner, you always know that that's an option and a possibility that that could happen again. So then if they're using one of these other tactics or strategies, you already have in your lived experience within your body, well, I don't want them to hurt me like they did before. So if I have to acquiesce to one of these other forms of abuse, then maybe that's the safest and best thing that I can do. But it certainly isn't to say or to minimize any of these other forms of abuse that could be happening when sexual or physical violence isn't present. So another thing that Ariel spoke of last week, and our terminology might be slightly different, but it's really getting to the same point, this thing that's often referred to as a cycle of violence. And I think it's important just to note that in any human relationship, patterns develop. In healthy relationships where there is no violence, patterns develop of how we interact with each other, who prefers to weed the garden and who prefers to take out the trash, those kinds of things. That's all just human stuff. When there's violence, part of the pattern is reflected in this thing that's sometimes called the cycle of violence. So there is this time, I think last week it was referred to as the honeymoon phase, that we refer to as the rebonding or reattachment phase. What it's about is the best of times or the least bad times. It's whatever brings that, tends to bring those people drawn back to each other. And there can be some healthy stuff and there could be some not so healthy stuff. But what's important to know is that it can feel like a break from the violence. And sometimes it doesn't feel that way. And that this cycle can happen within a few hours, or it could take months and months for tension to build and eventually for there to be an explosive moment or episode. And again, depending on the strategy, if it's physical or sexual violence, then that explosion is going to be in the form of direct physical or sexual violence. But let's say that the strategy being used is a lot of really intense emotional abuse, mind games, gaslighting. That's where the worst of that stuff is going to happen. It would have been building up, and then something that causes the abused person to really doubt themselves might be the way that might play out. So within that cycle, which again is just a pattern, but it tends to repeat and change and usually escalate over time. And I want us to remember that what defines an intimate relationship within the legal context when looking at the domestic violence penal codes is that when they talk about intimate, they're saying that sex has occurred. So we have to remember that in these relationships, there is a sexual relationship, and oftentimes a consensual and possibly even very positive sexual relationship. And then there's also possibly sexualized violence. And the fact that both of those are there, sexualizing the violence becomes very effective for the abuser, and it's very confusing for the person that it's happening to. And the way that they describe it to us is going to sound different and change depending on where they are in that cycle, what experience it is that they're defining to us. And it's also important to remember that there are a lot of tactics within the strategy of sexualized violence. So of course it includes rape and other forms of sexual assault, but it's a lot of different things. It's threatening infidelity, it's being unfaithful, it's accusing the person, the abused person, of cheating, going so far as to check their underwear when they come back home. It's intentionally exposing someone to an STI, refusal to allow them to use any sort of safer sex or protective devices. It might be coercing pregnancy. That happens a lot in teen relationships. Or it may be threatening to terminate a pregnancy against someone's will, coercing abortion, or causing a miscarriage through violence. It also, of course, includes things like pornography, trafficking. The person may have entered into a relationship that then becomes a very controlling and abusive relationship, and that is actually the beginning of a sex trafficking situation where the so-called relationship was the cover for the trafficker to get access to that person. It includes threats to children of a sexual nature, and forcing people to have sex with other people, other children, animals. And you notice the last thing on the slide there is strangulation, and of course that would typically be listed under physical abuse. I put it here because I want to say there's a very strong correlation between sexualizing the violence and the use of strangulation, and strangulation is really high on any lethality assessment tool, as is sexual violence, but strangulation specifically, and sometimes strangulation, which the person might describe to you as being choked, they might use choked rather than strangulation, but either way, what they're talking about is that either the blood supply being shut off to their brain or their airways being closed off, or both. And this is sometimes introduced within the context of a sexual relationship as part of quote unquote play, sexual play, and then escalates to really dangerous levels. Sorry about the honking in the background. So going back to that cycle and thinking about, and I'm going to ask that people speak up or chat in some responses. If you knew somebody who felt comfortable enough and safe enough to actually share with you information about their consensual sexual relationship, what are some ways that they might describe, what words might they use to talk to you about their feelings or their experience of consensual sex with a partner? Anyone have any thoughts? And I can't see the chat. Oh, but Ariel can.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I don't know, I didn't think of any specific words, but I would just imagine they would be smiling or, you know, giggling or, you know, some nonverbal display that they're, like, brings them joy to think about the experience.
Right. Yeah, we always hope that. Hope that sex can be joyful. Anyone else have any thoughts? So they might share with us, certainly it would be consensual. They might talk about it as being really good, exciting. They might talk about it more as a sense of connection. They might just describe it as the least bad or the least negative. They might talk about it in terms of romance or love, feeling good. They might use words like vulnerable, and in this context, they're not usually meaning vulnerable as in fearful. They're using vulnerable as a way to express a feeling of openness between themselves and their partner. They might say, this is when I feel like we're really vulnerable with each other, and they're meaning that they're being open and sharing some good stuff. Now, if the abuser does not use sexually violent tactics against their partner, what can happen is, even though at other times when they're not having sex, there could be all kinds of forms of abuse, when they're in their consensual sexual relationship, there isn't anything that they would identify as abusive. And so this can feel like a real oasis. It can be part of one of the things that keeps someone in the relationship, is because this can feel really special and really good and comfortable. And so from the outside, you might think, one of us might think, well, but how could you ever feel really good about the sex life if at other times there's really crappy stuff going on? But, you know, one of the tools that most of us humans have is to compartmentalize. And so if sexualized violence isn't a part of the dynamic, it can feel like completely different things going on. So then if somebody was trying to describe to you how things in their sex life changes in the tension building time, if someone felt safe enough to really talk to us about it, what might that start to sound like, or what dynamics might start happening? I'm all alone out here. And you might just not be feeling like giving a response, and that's okay. But I also want to say that sometimes this is a reflection of that it's really hard to talk about sex, let alone sexual violence. And part of why I think it's important is because if we can't, the person we're serving can't, because they're going to feel that we're uncomfortable.
One person in the chat said weird.
Yes, could definitely start feeling weird.
And said they might feel pressured.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Because during that tension building time, people are already feeling pressure and stress. And what starts to happen is that threats around their sex life might happen towards the partner or towards the children. For example, if you don't do what I want, our son is right upstairs. Can you imagine that somebody might acquiesce to sex rather than bear the thought that one of their children could be harmed in this way? They might refer to it as, this is, I kind of placate my partner. They want to have sex. I don't really want to because they're being mean to me, but this is the better option than denying them. It might be a time where there's a lot of demeaning or belittling things about the survivor's body or their sexuality. And either partner might withhold sex. The abuser might withhold sex as a way of shaming or making the person feel like nobody would want to be sexual with you, you're not good enough, you're not attractive enough, whatever. It's just another way to control. But it's also true that the person who's being abused might withhold sex. Any thoughts on why they might do that?
Well, yeah, if somebody, one person said fear of pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
Someone said power over. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like, if there isn't sexualized violence happening in the relationship, it might be one of the only areas where the survivor can safely sort of exert control over the situation.
Exactly. I think that's a really important point. If this partner is not using sexual violence, this might be the place where I have a right to say yes or no. And that can feel very powerful. It's also true, I don't know about all of you, but for me, if somebody's been treating me like, really badly and being mean to me, I don't particularly want to have sex with them. So I could withhold sex just because I'm not in the mood to have sex with somebody who's doing any of these forms of abuse, sexual or otherwise. And if my partner isn't a rapist, I can probably, quote, get away with that, with drawing that line. And it's also complicated because in many nonviolent relationships, sex is a way that people come back together, get over a stressful time, make a connection again. And of course, that's different from what we're talking about here, but it's part of what makes it confusing. And then as the tension builds over time and these things start escalating, depending on the abuser, then during the explosive phase, that might be the time where a violent rape, any other kind of sexual assault could be happening against the partner and including sexual abuse of the children. And that could take many, many different forms of how that might play out. So the reason that I wanted us to have this in mind to hopefully understand that depending on the person that you're serving, or that we're trying to serve anyway, how this is playing out in their relationship is complex and complicated. And it's also one of the hardest things for them to talk to. It's where there's lots of shame that people have internalized about sex in general and sexuality. And this gets even more complicated if we're talking about somebody who would identify in the queer community or trans community, where maybe their sexuality or their gender identity is being used against them in some way. Then that's going to be maybe very challenging for them to talk to us about it. So I named a few things. Anything else you think makes it really hard for people to talk about the sexualized violence component?
Somebody said, so I'll just read a couple that are coming in. stigmas and taboo,
Mm-hmm.
feelings of shame, and someone else said cultural aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I have some of those here. Yeah, and even, of course, cultural and religious messages, but also culture in the sense of the family culture. You know, is this something that ever gets talked about? And certainly all of the same barriers that any survivor might face. And also a misunderstanding about whether it's okay to say no or to indicate no, withdraw with consent from somebody that you've already had sex with. Not only might the survivor be confused about that, they're probably getting gaslighted by their partner to be confused about that, but also the world around them might be sending that message. Or you'll hear people say, well, yeah, that's not cool that they did that, but it's not like you weren't already having sex with them. And of course, there's night and day difference between having consensual sex with someone and being violated, having choice taken away. And the physical and emotional experience of it is completely different. But because people around them say things like that and kind of minimize their experience, they might not even feel that it's okay to name what happened to them as abusive, and let alone using words as clear as something like rape. So we just need to keep in mind that that's a challenge for folks. And among lots of other barriers is isolation, which connects with what is happening with COVID, because of course isolation is a common strategy used by abusers, separating that person from their support systems. And if it's already going to be really, really hard to talk about the violence or abuse at all, and layer on it how hard it is to talk about sexual violence, then that isolation is going to be very, very effective. So in this time, if I'm successful here, I'm going to play just a little clip out of this video, and I need to advance it to a particular moment. And these are survivors who are, the beginning of this video, if you ever want to look at it, they're sharing some pretty intense stuff. I'm not going to have us watch that right now. Where we're going to enter the video is where they're beginning to talk about how COVID has impacted survivors. So as quickly as I can, I will move this forward to the right spot.
I'm not hearing sound from the video.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if
Sorry.
anyone else is. Are you hearing it on your computer?
Yes.
Hmm.
Is anyone hearing it?
People are saying no sound in the chat.
Oh, sorry. Well, I guess
You should, if you have your mic on and it's playing out of your computer, they should hear it. Maybe just turn it up more.
Okay.
When you share your screen, there's supposed to be a thing in like the right-hand corner that says share sound as well for video.
Oh, thank you. Not seeing that. Here. Audio settings. Not seeing something in the right-hand corner.
You would have to stop sharing your screen and then share your screen. And when it asks you to share your screen for the second time, when it's either in the left or the right hand
Oh,
corner.
yeah.
Top.
I see. Yeah, when you click share screen, when it pops up and you like are selecting what part of your screen to share. In
Oh,
the
share
bottom,
computer.
yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. All right, now, to get back into here and get back to the,
Someone else suggested if you can turn on the closed captions as well. If they're
what do I mean?
available on that video.
Yeah, I don't think so. Slideshow from here. Zoom slideshow. Okay.
It actually.
Okay, sounds like we're hearing it now.
Okay, good. Thank you, everybody, for your help.
Crisis, it tends to escalate domestic violence, in particular in this situation. What really concerns me is the idea of being quarantined and being in a space with a partner that is abusive.
I just couldn't imagine a woman who's been assaulted or offended, who's in or isolated with someone.
Some of them might be having the time of their life with this, just making their partners look as crazy as possible. I would have been trying to survive the best way that I knew how, which was don't ruffle any feathers. There would have been no way to even talk to my friend now if she would call and say, hey, how are you really doing? I wouldn't have had moments to myself going to the next room and cry in the way that I needed to cry.
What I think of immediately is just the toll, the emotional toll that abuse takes on somebody. And if you can think of a situation where you might have some space to decompress from that, like you might go to work and come back, or you might be doing things with your children and come back, versus a situation where you can't ever get away from that person, it can emotionally and mentally become really daunting.
If you're in the house and if both people lost a job, not going to work and so forth, you're there together. So it's like, how is it going to react? What's going to come out?
That additional stress of perhaps having economic instability, given the situation, could also escalate it.
The lack of financial stability, I know, would have really made things really worse. Like the person, my abuser, would have turned it on me to say, why aren't you doing something about this? It's your fault that we're in this situation.
You really do have to protect yourself.
Do what you can to keep yourself safe. If that means the abuser likes the house clean, clean the house. Don't feel like anyone's going to judge you for doing what you had to do to survive. Right now, get all your documents together. All your most important documents, if you can put them in one place, do the little you can to take care of yourself. If you can take a shower and think for a few minutes of something beautiful that's meaningful to you outside of your abusive situation, go to that place in your mind. The possibility of you having a different life after this is real.
There is a percentage of our population that we know.
So I'm going to stop it there. And, we heard one of the survivors there talk about whatever you can do. And she said, if they want the house clean, clean it. And I just want to say that I know that what she's not saying, she's talking about risk reduction. She's talking about surviving. She's not meaning to say that you could ever figure out exactly what to do to keep the abuser satisfied, because we all know that that's just not the case. But I really loved the last thing that I appreciated that she was saying, do what you have to do to get through this time and survive. And that, in fact, is what everybody in that situation is doing. And that's one of the reasons why so often survivors are judged for decisions that they might be making, that we might be making, because from the outside, it might not make sense to somebody. But when you're living it, you learn over time, as she was indicating, the small things that you might be able to do to keep yourself slightly safer or to relieve stress. Like she talked about, just being in the shower and being able to clear her mind, to in effect take herself somewhere else, even for a moment, to relieve that stress. And that's just so, so important. So I really appreciated what she had to say. Any reflections anybody else is having about what we heard from them? And if chats come in, Ariel, just let me know. Well, we know that there's increased isolation. We're all feeling that. And that means that there's increased time, that time is possibly even more stressful. They're spending that time in possibly very stressful and volatile homes. I want to say, as kind of addition to this, that one of the things that we've heard from some students who were sent home during COVID, they were returning to volatile home situations where maybe they grew up witnessing domestic violence and now they're having to go back into that same energy. And it's very, very stressful, especially they had a kind of an escape from it and now they don't have that. They don't have another place to be. And so whether it's somebody directly experiencing it or in that example, somebody who has to live with it, it's just that tension is just so palpable. It's also, COVID has also caused an increase in financial dependency. Maybe only one of the people is working at all, or maybe only one of them could qualify for either unemployment or some other kind of COVID-related benefit. And that, of course, then increases the sense of vulnerability and the sense of need to stay together. And of course, we here at Rape Crisis, and I'm sure all of you too, we understand why people stay, and we're not judging people. They stay or not stay. We understand that it's very complicated, and there might be coming and going, leaving and coming back, and all of those things. And people get judged about that. And so we try to come from a place of reassuring people that if they have left, that we're glad for them, that they're in a safer space. But we also want them to know if that changes, if they're back with that partner, that we're still here for them 100%. We're not in the business of trying to tell them what the safest or most possible thing to do is. And I think COVID has just made it so much harder for people to even envision choice to do anything. And one of the things I liked that one survivor said there at the end was that a better time will come, that a different life is possible. And I don't think it's always easy to feel that. And maybe that's something that, without being, overly rainbows and flowers about it, that we might be able to give encouragement to somebody. And we want to remember that during COVID, the children are stuck there too. And families are struggling with having all these people together where maybe they were used to the kids being at school and at least one partner being at work. And so they had time and space away from each other. And maybe now they have very little of that. And you also have some controlling things that I've been hearing about where the abusive person isn't allowing their partner to take the children out to get fresh air, to go somewhere for a walk, or they're forcing them out and claiming the home as their space. And the partner and possibly children, they're just left to go somewhere for the day, just go somewhere because the abuser wants to have the space to themselves. And it's also caused a decreased sense of actual available options. Families and friends may be less available, maybe less open to the idea of people coming to stay with them for a while. understandably because they're concerned about their own health. But nevertheless, that feeling like doors being shut. And also those of us providing community resources, our services. Most of us, our services have changed in some way. And those changes may have caused people to feel like the services are less accessible. And in some ways, they're right, they are less accessible. And some of the services aren't existing at all. So the person in that situation, that pressure cooker that's often talked about within intimate partner violence, just imagine that the heat under the pressure cooker has really, really been turned up. And people, as they do, the resiliency in people is amazing. They are finding ways to let steam off, to get out of the house even for moments, to use their de-escalation skills. And of course, they shouldn't have to do any of those things because they never should be being treated in this way. And yet they have to develop those skills of avoidance and de-escalation and their own strategies of survival, because otherwise they won't survive. So that's a strength in them, not a weakness, and it sometimes gets framed back to them as that they're not brave enough or strong enough to do something differently than somebody thinks they should. And so when we think about all of that, it's going to affect the choices that they make. They might not see an exit strategy, and they might feel like they have to stay, even if they had already made a decision to leave, whether they were going to leave temporarily or long term. Maybe that's not even a possibility now, or it sure doesn't look like a possibility. They might actually, and I've heard this from more than one person, that they've gone out into the world in what they self-describe as high-risk situations in order to get respite from their partner, especially if they're living with their partner, which then increases their exposure to COVID and increases their risk of violence, because as they've described it, they're out there looking for something to do, and they might be, as they've described it, more likely to kind of connect with somebody that they don't know or don't have any experience of whether they're a trustworthy person, or they may have gone to somebody that they thought they could trust, and now it turns out that that person is going to break that trust and harm them. I've also heard from somebody that they went out to get away from their partner, and then the partner wouldn't let them back in, and stated that the reason that they wouldn't let them back in is because now maybe they had been exposed to COVID. That didn't seem to be the real concern, but that was the concern stated. And I'd heard from someone in another county, they had a similar situation there. And the person who actually owned the house, the survivor, wasn't allowed or supported by law enforcement to regain entry because they might have been exposed to COVID. And then they had nowhere to go. And so I heard about that from a sister agency in another county, but I'm sure something like that has or could happen here too. And so as they're out there and possibly connecting with less safe people than they usually do, especially if their friends and families are not open to having them there, they might find themselves in particularly dangerous situations around their health and around violence. And what I'm hearing is from folks that we serve, but also from other organizations, that the self-blame that survivors often feel increases too, because they say to themselves, well, I should have just stayed at home. I shouldn't have been out there. Any other impacts on choice that you all can think of? So maybe you could chat in or speak up. What can any of us do about it? How can we be supportive? What do you think would help somebody?
Two people said listening, one person said listening and not judging.
Yeah. There's nothing really more important than that, is there? Being willing to hear somebody, really listening to them, and here I don't mean necessarily through our ears, being able to be present with somebody's experience and not judge them for the situation that's happening to them, not judge them for the decisions that they're making as they're trying to survive. I don't think there's anything more important that we can do is to really listen well and not judge. Are there any other thoughts?
I think like if it's safe to do so, offering someone a place to go to, even if it's just like kind of hang out and decompress for a while.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And a lot of the places that we might have been able to shelter somebody because of COVID, those options are much less available, if available at all. And not only that, but even the option of helping somebody with transportation out of the area, the places where they might have gone are fewer and farther between. So for example, we often have had success when we can't find a shelter resource for someone here in Humboldt County, or it's not safe for them to stay in Humboldt County. We sometimes have been able to access services for them through Harrington House in Del Norte, or up in Oregon, Oasis, or a variety of different places. But those places especially aren't sheltering anyone who's not from their own community because of the fear of the virus being brought from one location to another. And so it's completely understandable why those services have had to limit. And it's just a sad reality. And so I appreciate what you said, Ariel, because maybe it's not about a kind of semi-permanent place for them to go. It could be any respite, having a way to have a little bit of space from the stress and the tension that's at home.
Yeah, I recently was talking to someone, a friend, and I was like, if you ever need to come sit in my backyard, because at my house, because of COVID, we're not having guests over, but it's like even just thinking about ways to do that safely. It might not seem like a big thing, but I think if someone has nowhere to go, they're not necessarily going to, they could go sit in their car somewhere, but that might kind of feel like, well, I might as well just stay home. But if we actually offer them a place to sit and drink some tea or something,
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. And it makes me think that maybe another thing that we can do is be talking to people in our lives, because so for us here at Rape Crisis, and I know this isn't what you were saying, Ariel, I wouldn't feel like I could invite one of the people we serve to come hang out at my house. There'd be all kinds of boundary things that would come up for me. But there are people in my life that I could offer that to. And so maybe something that all of us could be thinking about is, can we have these conversations with people in our lives who might have people in their lives that could benefit from something like hanging out in the backyard and having a cup of tea? To help people understand they don't have to do huge things. They don't have to, quote, solve the problem. which I think is a barrier to people helping, is a feeling that, well, what's that going to solve? Well, it's not going to solve the big problem. That's the hard work that the survivor is working through. But any respite could sure help them be able to, refocus themselves. So I really appreciate you saying that. It makes me think like there's someone in my neighborhood that I feel like I could have a conversation who might be able to extend something to someone in their life. And if we all did that even with one person, maybe that could matter. So thank you for saying that. Like you all said, start off with listening, believing, not judging the person. And something that's hard for a lot of people is to actually respect and support the choices that the person makes. You might not agree with them. You might think that there's a better way, but they're making a choice that's what will work for them. And at the same time, we can make supportive, non-judgmental reality checks. So if somebody's telling us a choice they're making that you're feeling like, oh God, that sounds super dangerous, there's a way to offer that reflection to them that's not judging them. Maybe of saying, yeah, I can understand why you're thinking about that. And I'm also hearing from what you described some really potential danger there. Can we talk about that? So they know it's not that you're telling them that they're making a quote bad decision. You're naming your concern for their safety. And they may or may not be able to take that concern in. But, my experience has been that somebody might kind of push back or reject something, but that doesn't mean they didn't hear it. It doesn't mean that at a future moment, they might be able to reflect on that thing that you shared with them. And we can be real about how hard it is in general to be in this situation and how really super hard it is right now. And I think sometimes just sitting in it with somebody, and I don't mean getting into their crisis, but being there, bearing witness, being willing not to just say, oh, let's think happy thoughts, but to say, yes, you're right. The situation you're in is really, really hard. And can we talk about it? And I think sometimes some people in the world want to quickly move somebody from feeling sad or scared or bad about something and get them to feeling happy and good. And that's all great, but it doesn't just happen at the snap of a finger. So being willing to be real about it and validating, as I'm sure you all do, their feelings, their experiences. They're the ones who know what's going on. And so really being able to reflect that back to them. And to be sure that, we're always coming from that place of no matter what, violence is a choice that someone else made. And when I say violence, I mean any of the forms of abuse. And that the person that it's happening to didn't cause it. So going back to the video when the woman shared with us an example, yeah, they want the house clean the house. Maybe that reduces the risk. We all know that an abuser might just find something else to do, but we know that a lot of survivors are trying everything they can to de-escalate and to reduce the harm that might happen to them or to their children. And so, we want to show some respect for that, and that the reality is, and we can also share this with them, there isn't a way to second guess the abuser. And so it's not that they have somehow failed in not finding the way to make their abuser stop abusing them. It's that the abuser would have to be willing to deeply look in, deeply challenge layers of a sense of privilege and entitlement and all of the factors that may have created this violence within them. And that's the hard work that the abuser would have to do. And I want to say that I am a hopeful person who absolutely believes in the possibility of change for people, including people who've done great harm. But I also believe that they have to work really, really, really hard at it and make a very, very deep commitment to it. And that even if they make a really big change, that doesn't mean that the harm that they caused didn't happen. And so, you know, it's a both and thing. We can hope for people to change their abusive behaviors. And in the meantime, we can sure let people know that if it's happening to them, if someone is being harmful to them, they don't deserve it. They didn't choose it. It's not their fault. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that healing isn't just possible, it's happening. Those of us who are fortunate enough to work in service to survivors of trauma, we get to see it every day. And so some people in their lives might not see that growth and forward movement and healing is happening because it can be so incremental and sometimes imperceivable. But it is happening. People are doing things to try to keep themselves as safe as possible in really difficult circumstances. And if we at Rape Crisis can ever be of assistance to anyone you're serving or assistance to you, if you just want to call and chat and talk about this stuff some more, I'm totally open to that, or email back and forth. Of course, protecting confidentiality of people that any of us are working with. If you've got secondary trauma issues around having heard some particularly difficult stories or stories that touched on a lived experience of your own, know that if you were to call us, anything that you would share with us would be absolutely confidential, not shared with anyone without explicit consent. So we hope that we can serve our community in terms of those who are directly experiencing harm, but also in being there for each other like we are today. And I just really, really want to appreciate Ariel for putting together this opportunity for some of us who are in these roles of trying to be there to support trauma survivors, to have opportunities just to reflect on these things and remember that we also all need to be thinking about our own self-care, spaces that we can take, moments that we can take to kind of recharge and re-empower ourselves because we deserve it and need that, and also because it will make it more possible for us to be in service to someone else. And I have one other slide I want to end on, but before I do, is there anything that anyone is wanting to say or share?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. I always appreciate hearing you speak about these topics, because even though we sort of, as you mentioned, like are talking about this similar things with the power and control wheel and the cycle of violence, we have different sort of approaches to talking about it. So I always feel like I learned something.
Thank you, Ariel, and I feel the same way when you're sharing. And from all of us who are in this together, you know, I learn from all of you every time I get the opportunity to connect. And boy, looking at this picture in front of us, we sure live in a beautiful place. And sadly, some of the folks we serve don't get very many opportunities to go out into nature, or that might not be helpful to them. But I know it's helpful for me, and I think it's important to feel the wind on our faces, feel fresh air in our lungs, and look around and see what's beautiful out there. And so I want to end on just a reminder to take a breath. And to honor yourself by finding those moments that help you, whether that's breathing, walking, listening to music, for me playing silly games on my phone as a distraction. Meditation is something that is really helpful to me. but remembering that underneath all of it is about breathing, and that there's no one right way, and that if we're offering coping or self-care strategies to others, to know that, you know, for example, meditation helps me, it might stress the heck out of somebody else. So, or, you know, I like to be at the beach. I feel good when I'm at the ocean. But I know people that hate the beach, so it wouldn't do me any good to tell them, hey, you should go to the beach. But maybe we can ask them, what is it that might be helpful? What is it that gives them even a moment's relief? Like the survivor shared with us, she would go in the shower, and in the shower, she would allow herself to take herself somewhere else. That was her wisdom. So maybe as we leave this presentation, we can all think about, what's your wisdom? What is it that you already know about yourself? What is it that you might be able to share with someone else? Or remind them, because everybody that we're serving, they do have resiliency, they do have coping strategies, they do have ways that they take care of themselves, but because they're in such difficult circumstances, often if they were asked if they have those things, they would say no. And maybe you can be the person that reminds them of something, that the wisdom that they already have inside themselves. And I just want to thank Ariel and HDVS for doing this series and for allowing Rape Crisis to be a part of it. And we'll certainly be looking forward to any additional ones that you do and listening in on those. And thank you to everybody who joined. And then I'll just toss it back to Ariel in case she has anything else she wants to say.
Thank you. Yeah, I love those breathing slides. They're so calming.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share real quick two things. Can you all see my screen? I think I did a...
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to, we have one more webinar coming up next week. If you go to the HDVS website, hdvs.org, and click on just events and outreach tab, our next webinar is going to be Sex Work is Work, Differentiating Sex Work from Human Trafficking, with Lasara Firefox Allen. I think that's going to be really great and informative. The link to register is there. And then also just we're starting up a virtual support group type space. So again, if you come to our website, go to our services and click on Healing Support Groups. We're starting up what I'm calling a survivor artist cohort. So it's going to be a virtual meeting space for survivors to basically just create art of any media about their experience or healing, really anything they want to. And so it'll be a twice monthly virtual meeting space. And so if you're interested in that, you can register for that here or download the flyer and share that. Would be really appreciated. But yeah, that's all I got. And otherwise, yeah, thank you so much again, Paula. Super informative and helpful and even a little uplifting, if I do say so myself.
That's always good. Thank you. Thank you. And Ariel, maybe later we can connect. I have another Zoom I'm going right into, but I'd like to connect just to hear any feedback you might offer. So if Rape Crisis was doing something like this again, we might do it better.
Sounds good. Okay. Thank you, Paula. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Have a good Friday.